So, straight on, what the agenda is, Roger is going to give his talk about practical energy and so forth for the UK. Then I'll give a thing about would the lights go out this winter and stuff like that. And then we'll have a discussion. Okay, Roger.
It's always good when people applaud to start with, because I'm never quite sure they're going to do that afterwards. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you, Piers, for inviting me to this event. Let me tell you where we are, and I can say this with some little measure of conceit, because what I think is what UKIP thinks, because I'm the energy spokesman, so there. And I did an advertising campaign several years ago, a poster advertising campaign, which contained 3 propositions about our green policies. And I thought they were quite succinct. They were each 2 words. And so 3 propositions, 2 words each, total of 6 words. Probably unnecessary, certainly ineffectual, and ruinously expensive. And that essentially summarizes what we are doing. And we are doing it because of the whole climate change scam. We're doing it because Brussels tells us to do it. And we are doing it even more in the UK, which we will come to. Now, why do I say it's unnecessary? Well, Piers is going to talk, I think, about the science in a moment, and I'm not qualified to preempt him on that. But if I can just summarise what I feel about it, what we see, and what we have seen for at least 12,000 years, which is the current interglacial, but arguably, some people would say for a very long period before that, is a roughly 1,000-year climate cycle. That has been going on. Of course, there are a number of cycles. There's a sort of 110,000 a year, 110,000 year cycle of interglacials, as we all know, and even longer cycles. But there is certainly a very clear 1,000-year cycle. That gave us the Holocene maxima. It gave us the Minoan optimum. It gave us the Roman optimum. It gave us the medieval warm period. And if you just extend that graph of global temperature, what you've got is a sine curve. I studied mathematics 50 years ago. You've got essentially, roughly speaking, a sine curve. And what would you expect to be happening today? I tell you what you would expect. You would say, good heavens, we're about due for another climate optimum, a new 21st century climate optimum. So in other words, the changes we have seen in the last 100 years, if you like, are exactly what a sensible scientist or statistician would have predicted 100 years ago if he'd had access to the sort of temperature data that we now have access to. If you talk to the European Commission, and I'm afraid for my sins I occasionally do, they will say, yes, we understand about those cycles, but the changes we have been seeing in recent years are so massive and so rapid that there must be another explanation, to which the answer is stuff and nonsense. And indeed, if you go back to the first IPCC report, they published a very nice graph, which they subsequently withdrew because they realised how embarrassing it was for their cause, in which that sine curve effect through the medieval warm period, then the Little Ice Age, and then coming into the modern era, was very clear. The slope of the graph before the medieval warm period was just like the slope of the graph that we're seeing at the moment, or have seen recently, and the temperature today was lower than it was in the medieval warm period. That graph, I think, was, so far as I know and know from other sources, that graph was pretty much accurate. So there is nothing to explain. Everybody is saying, here is a massive problem on which we must take action. What massive problem? There is no massive problem. We are looking at long-term natural climate cycles for which there is a mass of evidence. And the other point, which I think Lord Lawson has made and others have made, is that warm periods, on the whole, if you look at human societies and human history, warm periods tend to be more prosperous for human beings than cold periods, for reasons that are too obvious probably to go into. So we have a situation where there is nothing to explain, nothing that needs our action, because there is nothing unusual happening at all. Now, what I find fascinating, and I did a blog post on this only at the weekend, having heard our friend Mr. Roger Helmer of the BBC saying that the skeptics and the alarmists were converging together about a sort of 1.7 degree centigrade climate sensitivity. So I took him to task on that. But it seemed to me that he was making three assumptions, implicit assumptions, all of which are open to question. And one of which, frankly, I'm grateful to Roger Helmer, because I hadn't even myself worked out that it was an implicit assumption before. But everybody, or most people involved in the climate debate, say, look, we've had the Industrial Revolution, we've been burning amounts of fossil fuels that we haven't burned in the whole history of the world or the history of mankind, and we have seen CO2 levels going up. No dispute, we've got the Mauna Loa figures from Hawaii, we've seen CO2 levels going up. And you just assume that the reason CO2 levels are going up from what they love to call pre-industrial levels, bear in mind that for most of the pre-industrial period, CO2 levels in the atmosphere were very much higher than they are today, but that's another story. We just assume that obviously CO2 is going up, we're burning fossil fuels, the one must cause the other, mustn't it? Why do we assume that? Because if you look at the history of climate and CO2 levels and temperatures over at least 600,000 years and probably longer, what you see is that there is quite a good correlation between temperature and CO2, but you find, as I'm sure most of you around the table know, that there is a time lag, and that the temperature moves first and the CO2 moves afterwards. Now, anybody with the first understanding of the philosophy of science knows that effects do not precede causes. And it is a very strong supposition that there is a causal relationship between the temperature and the CO2, but you have to conclude that the temperature is causing the CO2, not that the CO2 is causing the temperature. And the mechanism is pretty clear and well understood. There is an estimated 50 times as much CO2 dissolved in the oceans as there is in the atmosphere, so it's tails and dogs. And the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is going to be materially affected by changes in the amount of CO2 in the oceans. The oceans warm, they're capable of dissolving less CO2, so some of that CO2 that was in the ocean comes out of the ocean into the atmosphere. It is, to me, entirely plausible. I was delighted talking to Peter before the meeting started, that actually he raised the same point without my even mentioning it, that it is perfectly plausible that the increases we have seen in CO2 in the last 100 years have actually been driven by the previous warming because of the 800 to 1,000 year time lag. So it isn't clear that human activity is even causing the CO2. Then, and I'm sure that Piers will cover this point, it is absolutely not clear that CO2 is causing the warming. CO2 is a greenhouse gas. I don't think anybody is arguing with that, but it's not such a powerful greenhouse gas as water vapour, and there is nothing we can do to control water vapour as long as the wind keeps blowing over the ocean. So even if you're concerned about greenhouse gases, CO2 is not the most important greenhouse gas. And secondly, nobody can plausibly believe that greenhouse gases are the only influence on climate, or the major influence on climate. There's that big hot thing in the sky. And I think that just about everybody would agree, well, it's the source of virtually all the energy we have on Earth, if you discount the nuclear decay in the core. And there is a wealth of evidence going back, especially over the last 1,000 years when we have sunspot records, a wealth of evidence that solar activity has a major effect on climate. You know, if you go back to the Little Ice Age, the Dalton minimum, and what's the other minimum called? Yeah, Maunder. Yeah, Dalton and the Maunder. Yeah, both of those extremely cold periods were associated with solar activity, so that correlation is well established. The so-called correlation between CO2 and climate over the shorter term is not well established at all. And in fact, I was born in 1944. The world started getting cooler until 1975, despite the fact that CO2 was going up. What you have, I was talking about 1,000-year cycles. There is also a 60-year cycle on top of the 1,000-year cycle, and the reason the temperature went down from 44 to 75 was that you were in the downward phase of the 60-year spiral, and the reason that the temperature appeared to rise very rapidly between 75 and 98 was that you had both the cycles, the 1,000-year cycle and the 60-year cycle, both going up together. So naturally you've got quite a lot of warming. But the warming you've got over the last 100 years is only 0.7 degrees centigrade. If you go back 12,000 years, as one often does, to the period called the Younger Dryas, at the beginning of the current interglacial, there were natural changes in global temperature of the order of 6 or 7 degrees in what may have been as short as a 10-year period, but was certainly a short period. There were no 4x4s driving around anywhere. Well, the other fact that I love, by the way, is that NASA report saying that the ice caps on Mars, which of course are CO2 ice caps, not water ice caps, but never mind, they respond to temperature. The ice caps on Mars have increased and decreased more or less in time with the ice caps on the Earth. That rather suggests to me that there is an external cause affecting both.
A very big Range Rover.
So, it's not clear that CO2 rise is caused by man. It's not clear that CO2 causes global warming. But it is abundantly clear that the policies we are putting in place have no effect at all, for a range of reasons. One, that technologies like wind and solar do not work in terms of reducing CO2 emissions. And two, regardless of what we're doing with renewables, there are, I'm told, 1,200 new coal-fired power stations in the global pipeline at the present moment, many of them in India and China.
1,200?
Yeah, that's been widely published.
Yeah.
CO2, man-made CO2 emissions will increase for the next few decades, whatever we do. We can crucify our economy if we want to, and we're having a pretty damn good go at it, but it will not reduce CO2 emissions, and it will not reduce levels of atmospheric CO2. So, is there any point in spending billions and billions of pounds and euros and dollars to reduce CO2 when we know that we cannot achieve it anyway? And sorry, one point I didn't make on the way through, which I should have made, and that is that all the best estimates seem to indicate that although we burn an awful lot of fossil fuel, nonetheless the total man-made emissions from human activity, the tautology, represent about 3% of the total global carbon cycle. Most of the carbon is coming either out of volcanoes, not only on land but also underwater. A few weeks of Icelandic volcano completely negates the whole world's emission control measures for the last 5 years. But you've got the underwater volcanoes that are pumping CO2 into the oceans all the time, and you've got the whole biosphere, animals, plants, plant decay, all those things. So human activity, yes, it's an awful lot of gigatons of CO2, but no, it isn't substantial in terms of the whole world's carbon cycle. One of the points I like to bring up to illustrate the absurdity of what we're trying to do and the way that these policies are hopelessly ineffectual. I'm sure you're all familiar with the work of Bjorn Lomborg, who is a distinguished environmental economist, and interestingly started out despising climate skeptics and determined to disprove all the nonsense that climate skeptics were churning out. And he actually got his graduate class at the University of Amsterdam or somewhere. No, Amsterdam, Copenhagen, wherever he is, he's Danish. And he got them studying various aspects of the problem, and to his horror he found actually that the sceptical position was right, and he's been arguing it ever since. He did a study of the effect of the massive investment that Germany has made in solar panels. Germany, he tells me, has spent 120 billion US dollars. The guy's publishing in America, so that's why it's in dollars. 120 billion US dollars. Billion, not million, billion. Big money on solar panels. And Bjorn then used his skills as an environmental economist to calculate the effect that those installations of solar panels would have on the climate by the end of the century. And he did that based broadly on the assumptions of the IPCC. He didn't start saying if they won't have any effects, we don't believe in climate change. He said if we accept the IPCC position on climate change and plug in those factors to the equation, what's the answer? Your $120 billion by the end of the century will have delayed the trajectory of climate change, global climate change, by 37 hours. Now, bear in mind that we haven't seen any climate change for 18 years. So if we get 0 for 18 years, divide 0, delaying it by 37 hours is effectively no result at all. The German economy has spent 120 billion US dollars for nothing, absolutely nothing. And another little point that I will make in an aside, because a good friend of mine used to be a Conservative MEP for Scotland, and he became very concerned. The John Muir Foundation, I'm sure many of you will know it in Scotland, that studies these matters. There's a debate about whether wind farms overall ever recover the CO2 emissions that go into building them and setting them up. But if you put them on peat soils, as you tend to do in Scotland, then there is absolutely no question that the CO2 you release from the peak disturbance, both in the, because you dig a hole about the size of a pair of semi-detached houses and fill it with concrete to put one of those turbines in, all that peat comes out and it lies there getting dry and emitting CO2. So at least in those we can be very clear, in a very significant proportion of the Scottish wind farms, wind turbines are emitting more CO2 than they could ever save. We then, though, come to the issue of intermittency, and I can't stress how important intermittency is, because when you're in the wind industry, you look at the cost of building a wind turbine and putting up a wind turbine, you look at the amount of output you get from the wind turbine, you allow for maintenance and stuff like that, and you divide one number by the other number, and you say, good heavens, we're approaching grid parity, we're only 1.5 times per megawatt the cost of running a proper power station. What they have ignored completely, well, they've ignored a whole series of things. For example, the decay in output over time. They've ignored the escalating costs of maintenance. But in a sense, those are relatively small. The big thing they've ignored is the inefficiencies in the backup. Now, we all know that you need backup. We all know that your gas-fired power stations are running on spinning reserve when they're waiting for the wind to drop. What a lot of people haven't quite realised, but the work of Professor Gordon Hughes at Edinburgh University brings this out very clearly. If you are running a gas-fired power station, not as you would want to do at 95% capacity continuously, but you're running it up and down to balance out wind, that is a hugely inefficient way of running a gas-fired power station. That creates two problems. Firstly, each megawatt that you produce from that gas-fired power station, which is running intermittently and ramping up and down, each megawatt burns more gas and emits more CO2 per megawatt than would be the case if you ran it properly. So that's the environmental problem, and to a significant extent, not totally, but to a significant extent, the extra gas burned in that context offsets the savings you thought you were making. But there is a more fundamental problem with it. And that is, if you're an investor and you say, I want to build a gas-fired power station, and you get your bank and your hedge fund, all those guys, they look at your business plan and they say, well, yesterday we had a guy who wanted a gas-fired power station, he was going to run at 95% capacity. Now you're coming to me with a business plan with a similar gas-fired power station, but you're going to run at average 45% capacity and keep ramping it up and down. So your investment plan is absolute rubbish compared to the other guy. Now, the European institutions are not stupid, they're not asleep on the job. They have recognised this problem, and they have introduced something called capacity payments. So not only are we subsidising, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself, so I'm going to talk about the subsidies in a moment, but bear in mind, this is another huge chunk of subsidy. You knew about subsidising the landowner, you knew about subsidising the operator, you knew about the ETS and the carbon tax, you knew about paying the guys to turn it off when we don't need the power. What you probably didn't know about was we're also paying subsidies to the backup operators to be available to fill the gaps. So the whole thing is absolutely daft. Let me just give you the Brussels perspective, because I was in Brussels this morning, so I may as well tell you I was at the European Energy Forum last night, and I've been very engaged in those things. If you talk to the European Commission, they will say we have 3 objectives in energy policy. We want energy supplies in Europe to be sustainable. Now, I dispute their use of the word, because I would argue that renewables are wholly unsustainable, but that's another point. Sustainability, in other words, low emissions. Competitiveness, we've got to supply energy to European industry and households at prices that are competitive. And security of supply. The point is that they have focused on what they call sustainability exclusively, and they have completely ignored these other aspects. Those problems are now coming home to roost. And even sustainability, for the reasons I've described, they haven't achieved sustainability in their terms. I think it is unsustainable because it isn't delivering the planned reduction in emissions, and it's particularly unsustainable because it's economically unsustainable. But in terms of energy security, we've got a whole series of things going on that we either failed to anticipate or didn't realise quite how serious they were going to be. For a start, we've got the European Union's Large Combustion Plant Directive, so we're going around closing coal-fired power stations. Then we've got the nuclear fleet, which sadly is ageing, and we haven't been able to agree about replacing the nuclear fleet. I mean, there are some developments now, but they're too little too late. And we have another problem with coal, which I only came, I'm ashamed to admit this, but I only really got to understand, I think, in the last few weeks. a lot of people write to me and say, why is it that we in Britain are not building any coal-fired power stations when the Germans, get this, the Germans have 24 new or refurbished coal-fired power stations in the pipeline? I thought it was just a case that the cost of upgrading British coal-fired power stations to new European specifications was too great. But no, apparently this coalition government 2 or 3 years back passed a law that said if you wish to build a coal-fired power station, you will only be permitted to do so if you have carbon capture and storage, which is a scam nearly as big as climate change, I have to tell you. The idea was that we would then build coal-fired power stations in Britain and they would come with carbon capture and storage. Unfortunately, they ignored the market and economic reality. The effect is, because carbon capture and storage is A, not really available and untried, and B, vastly expensive, nobody has built any coal at all. We've got 200 years worth of coal in Britain. We've got cheap coal coming from America. We could be producing electricity very cheaply from coal, and we're not doing it. And we're not doing it because we've made a set of silly rules. Yet again, we've all got this cliche that we know about gold-plating European laws. But it's not just a cliche, it happens again and again and again. Europe wants us to reduce emissions, so we pass this damn silly law that the Germans don't pass, and the result is the Germans are building cheap coal-fired capacity and we are not. And it is quite preposterous. But the German experience, I mean, I've already mentioned Germany in the photovoltaics. They've exacerbated their problems by closing their nuclear fleet. But incidentally, just a little contrast. I believe that at least 250,000 people have died in hydro accidents. Bear in mind that everybody thinks hydro is green and cuddly, but at least 250,000 people have died in hydro accidents. At least 250,000 coal miners have died, and arguably many more members of the public have died as a result of respiratory diseases from the coal industry over time. The total number of deaths in the nuclear industry, last time I checked, was approaching 100. Not 100,000, 100. And yet people are terrified of nuclear because it's supposed to be so dangerous. But the Germans are simply not getting the output from that massive investment in solar and wind. They've got wind as well, but they're having to back it up with good old-fashioned coal because it's the only way they can keep the lights on. What are we going to do in the UK to keep the lights on? And Peter very kindly mentioned this earlier on, but the Department for Energy and Climate Change has got 2 plans. Plan number 1 is called demand management, which sounds very professional, doesn't it, and very well considered. What it amounts to is going to large companies and saying, can we do a deal with you where in exchange for money we can turn you off when we need to? Now that's what I call a power cut. I don't call it demand management, I call it a power cut. But never mind, they're going to do that. Now the other brilliant plan they've got is to go to all the organisations that have diesel generators to provide uninterrupted power for your kidney machine when you're in the hospital and all that kind of good stuff. And they're saying, can we contract with you so that if we're a bit short, you can run your diesel generators and put that power into the grid to keep us going. So in other words, we've got this brilliant scheme to get decarbonised energy for which we're paying through the nose and every other orifice you can think of on layer after layer after layer of subsidy. And on top of all that, we say, when it all goes wrong, we're actually going to pay lots and lots and lots more for diesel. I forget the figures, I have read them somewhere, but I mean they're paying way, way over the odds.
I saw a figure of 40-fold.
In order to fill those gaps. Then of course we get to the question of affordability. We've got, we as Europe, or we as Britain, are competing with the United States, who have extraordinarily cheap shale gas. I've been out a couple of times to look at those shale operations. We've got Asia, which as I mentioned already, China and India are using coal. And we have the vast costs of these renewables. I talked about the layers of subsidy at just about every level, including the capacity payments for the backup. I discovered a new layer of subsidy just recently. It's not frankly a big one, but it's just an example of how we keep pumping money into the nonsense. The National Air Traffic Service, NATS, you wouldn't really think they were funding renewables, would you? But they were concerned about the impact of wind farms on their radars, which they use to manage air traffic safety, and they are spending out of their money, collected from airlines. So you know, anybody who uses airlines or air cargo gets to pay for it. They're actually paying at least £14 million for an upgrade for a limited number of radars, and that is part of a larger project, and I've written to them asking how expensive they expect the larger project to be. But I mean, you couldn't make it up. Everywhere you turn, there are more and more and more costs for these damn silly things.
So you have to upgrade the radar so that you can see past the
You can see past the wind farm, yeah. Anyway, I want you to understand that this is not merely the view of UKIP's energy spokesman. We just had two outgoing European commissioners, Günther Oettinger, the German, who has been the energy commissioner. He's now got a new commissioner, I forget which one, but he's staying on. And the other one is Antonio Tajani, who was the vice president of the commission and was the industry commissioner. So presumably these guys know a little bit about what they're talking about. Mr. Günther Oettinger said, Europe can no longer afford to pursue a unilateral energy policy. Well, it took us 5 years to get that banged into his skull, and my fear now is we've got a new lot who don't know that, and it's going to take us another 5 years to bang it into their skulls. Mr. Tajani was even more outspoken, and I love the phrase that he used. He said, we are creating an industrial massacre in Europe. That was his phrase, we're creating an industrial massacre. Now that's strong language for a European commissioner. What are the impacts of high energy prices in Europe and in Britain? Energy-intensive businesses, and an awful lot of energy-intensive businesses, the chemicals industry, cement, glass, metals, a huge range of business. Oil refineries themselves. I'm going to a UK Petroleum Industry Association dinner in Brussels if I get back in time tonight. They are saying that refineries in Europe are closing down because it's cheaper to import petrol from other jurisdictions. Which brings me to a key point. These companies are going abroad, they are taking their investment, they are taking their jobs, they are taking their businesses away from Europe entirely. Even those that are staying are directing new investment outside Europe. Big German companies like Siemens, BASF, BMW have actually publicly said we are moving investment out of the European Union because of energy prices. So we're creating an industrial massacre. Bear in mind that they're going to other jurisdictions typically with lower environmental standards. The result of that is, they call it carbon leakage. Again, it sounds so innocent, doesn't it? Carbon leakage. What they mean is, there is more CO2 coming from out there, and frankly, if CO2 made in Taiwan is just the same in global terms as CO2 made in Turin, the thing is daft. I was told by the steel industry that if you make a ton of steel in China, the emissions are typically about double what they would be if you made the same ton of steel in Germany. So there is a case to be made that we are moving jobs and investment out of Europe while at the same time increasing global emissions. And a statistic that illustrates it, Europe is responsible for about 12% of global emissions in Europe. But if you then take the implied emissions of products imported into the EU from elsewhere, Europe is about 25%. And that's because we moved our emissions to other countries like China and so on. It's not only that we're destroying our economy, we're also, of course, damaging households and pensioners. Fuel poverty is now becoming a major factor. And it's becoming a major factor not because of external decisions of OECD and Mr. Putin and all those things. It is becoming a problem because of deliberate policy decisions which Brussels and London have made. What do we think we should do about it? Well, the first thing, and this goes back to what Piers was saying earlier on, we want to repeal the Climate Change Act. The Climate Change Act was simply a piece of madness. I mentioned gold plating earlier on. We took the directives coming out of Brussels, the targets coming out of Brussels, and we actually made them tougher and longer lasting for Britain. And we do it again and again. I mean, George Osborne's put in a carbon price floor because he felt that the price of carbon under the ETS was too low. And that has given us a specific competitive disadvantage in Britain against the rest of Europe, never mind Europe's competitive disadvantage against the rest of the world. So we've got to repeal the Climate Change Act, and I'm delighted to be at a meeting where we're talking about that. We believe we've got to rely on grown-up technologies, not playground technologies. And by grown-up technologies, we mean baseload. You can't run a modern economy without baseload electricity, and wind and solar are not baseload. Coal, gas and nuclear. And we did mention Mr. Putin briefly. Clearly the Ukraine situation has drawn attention to our reliance on what is a very unreliable, politically unstable regime. And we know that fracking is unpopular, and we know that lots of people are forming protest groups. We believe that shale gas is as important as North Sea oil, possibly more important. We believe it is absolutely critical to our energy security to our balance of payments, to our future economic development. We believe that while it does need to be properly regulated and properly supervised, it can be done safely and cleanly. It is certainly a hell of a lot safer and cleaner than coal, for example. And my message to the miners who hated being closed down, as they would say by Margaret Thatcher, we could talk about that. Here we have a new energy technology which extracts energy from under the earth, just like we used to with coal, only this is cleaner and safer, and it does not involve thousands of men spending 30 years underground getting pneumoconiosis. We should be rejoicing all the way to the gasometer. We're not against renewables entirely. I personally do not believe that wind farms will ever be competitive, but certainly with solar there is very substantial scope for increased efficiency. I think they're running about 17-18% now on the most modern solar panels. If you can develop a solar panel at 40%, which we may well have got in 10 years' time, then even with the intermittency, it might make some kind of sense. Can it possibly make sense to be investing billions of pounds in technology which is hopelessly inefficient, which is hopelessly uneconomic, where we will turn around in 5 years or 10 years' time and say, why on earth did we invest all that money in that clunky, old-fashioned technology? We would rather spend millions on developing efficient technology rather than invest billions in technology which will very soon be old-fashioned. Our position is quite clear. We have got to deliver secure and affordable energy. We know how to do it. We've just got to get all this climate change nonsense and green and renewable stuff out of the way so that we can actually have energy that will support a British economy that is successful. Thank you.
Well, that was superb, Roger.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Very good, very good. Shall we give some questions to Roger before I do my bit, especially because you know...
I'd like to ask Roger, whether in the EU you have a pie-in-the-sky view about decarbonisation of the economy, 80% by 2050, or whether you've got the British Climate Change Act, which embodies that as a thing in the legislation. In either case, many of us that were aware this was going through thought, well, this is not even a possibility by 2050. Because you have to bring in other technologies that are not even at the early stage. You'd have to have massive energy storage, because otherwise you can't get rid of gas or coal as the backup to any of the renewables. So if you haven't got CCS and you haven't got energy storage, it's not feasible at all. Now, looking back in the history of energy, if you've got an aim which is so close to where you are now, the technology must exist now. There's never been a case in which you could bring forward an energy technology that quickly to account for it. I don't know whether anyone's asked that question.
Well, of course, what they will explain to you is that in 10 years' time we will have across Europe a fleet of 30 million electric vehicles. And we can use these for energy storage because we can actually call back. It is, you're right, it's absolutely absurd. I mean, there's a series of absurdities. One of the absurdities is to make a law about what we can do in 2050. And the way to see how absurd that is, supposing we were sitting here in 2014 and somebody came along and said, oh, by the way, there was a law that was passed in 1974 that said we had to do something, and we're all going to go to jail because we didn't do it. You know, it just doesn't make any sense at all. By all means, have targets if you want to have targets, but actually say a law that we must deliver when there is no sanction that can possibly be applied if you don't deliver is simply absurd. I agree with you. I mean, what they will say is that by setting aggressive targets, we incentivize industry to get on and find solutions. They'll say, look at the way in which emissions from motor cars have come down because we imposed draconian limits. So if you do that, then the industry will come up with solutions that make it work. Well, they may, but they may well not. I don't see any way, and I expect you don't see any way in which they will. The only consolation is, of course, that when the thing becomes impossible, somebody will have to repeal it, or either repeal it or ignore it.
Incidentally, on this business of the law and what happens later on, there's a precedent here because the Fuel Poverty Act matures in 2016. Now, there's going to be an awful lot more people in fuel poverty in 2016 than when it was first enacted. Do we sue the government? I mean, how do we make the government accountable for that? They failed to bring everyone
Which
up to
government, anyway?
Well, I can imagine them.
Sorry, it was them.
There might be a group action by disadvantaged people who but we're writing enormous sort of blank checks for the future here. It's simply absurd.
Do you think it's all
Yeah.
based on
One at a time.
dogma, the whole thing? Do you think it's
Okay, you
because it's so nonsensical?
I've got a theory about this. I don't think it's a conspiracy theory. I don't think any bad guys in the Sierra Club or whoever, or who are those guys who meet in Europe that Ken Clark goes to?
Bilderberg
Group. Yeah. I don't think they sat around and said, let's do something completely stupid and damaging and see if we can get away with it for a giggle. I think what happened was that somebody had this neat idea that maybe CO2 was a greenhouse gas and would warm things up. And that's the kind of simple concept that your average journalist can get his head round. Okay, so somebody writes a bit of a scare story. Now, in the media, you've got to double your scare story each time, otherwise it's not a news story. You know, if this year you say the sea level will rise by 10 feet by 2020, next year if you want a headline, you've got to say, no, it's going to be 20 feet by, and so on.
No, it doubles that as well.
Yeah, and then what you also get is you get a few people reading this in the Daily Mail, okay, and they write to their MPs. And instead of the MPs having sense to write back saying, well, this is an interesting theory, but we don't think there's sufficient evidence to justify taking any action, they write back and say, we understand your concerns, we are going to do something about it. And you then get scientists who want to outbid each other because they all want headlines and they all want papers published. You get media that want
And grants.
and grants. Media that outbid each other because they all want the next best headline. Politicians who outbid each other to reassure the public and say it's going to be all right and we're going to take action. And that creates a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. And it goes on until it hits reality, and I think it's now starting to hit reality because the whole thing is just so absurd.
Okay, that's interesting. I want to ask about that as well, but let's go on.
I was just going to say it's a very good speech you've given to this audience who are all on the same side. But one of the difficulties, the big problem we've got is persuading the people out there in the street, not the green people who are fanatics, but the ordinary people who just don't know. Now, Christopher Booker and David Rose have done a great job in respectively their articles, but of course it only gets to those people who read the papers.
Yeah.
What we really need is a big campaign, something that really will get stuff out there to the ordinary person. Now, next year we've got a general election coming up.
We have indeed.
And I wonder whether, alongside all the election material, if there couldn't be some sort of an organisation, maybe Peers organisation, or maybe the GWPF, somebody like that could get some good independent literature. Because when it comes from a political party, people think, oh, it's a same job. But if it was really well scrutinised, well put together, and get it out there to the ordinary public, do you think that would
well,
very possible?
I think we ought to look at ways of doing it. I mean, certainly from our party point of view, we've already got an outline manifesto, and we're very clear on energy, and the first thing we're going to do is repeal the Climate Change Act. So we've been as clear as we can on that. I don't know. I mean, I haven't got a magic bullet.
I think that, you see, we say many things, and what we say is true, but the BBC actually completely vetoes what
No, I understand.
we do.
That's why I'm thinking of a bypass mechanism.
A bypass mechanism, well, one is about using the election, and I'm thinking of that actually, because if you stand in the right place at the right time, the BBC have to film you. And some of us are thinking about having a bit of an impact in... Well,
you have an obligation.
there's an obligation for equal sound and so forth. And if we went to Ed Deranged Davies' constituency at Kingston upon Thames and stood a candidate which would make a bit of noise, perhaps we could have an impact. And interestingly, I'm going to be present at a meeting tomorrow where it's £1,000 to be there, as you know, but they've let 100 people in for free, where he's speaking nonsense, and some of us can come there and make a noise, which I don't know if you managed to book it through Faye, but she was
I
promoting
suggest the bypass mechanism is probably Facebook, Twitter,
social media.
blogs, social media. Because the BBC is the worst offenders, but actually ITV are not that good either.
No.
And part of the problem is that the man in the street has accepted. They hear this IPCC stuff all the time.
Yes.
And they only hear the political stuff. They don't get into the reality of the IPCC, which isn't quite as bad as if you look into the science.
But the point is, we've got loads of stuff on Twitter, and we have to move, above that, which is why I'm saying the elections. If we do it right, I mean, watch this space is all I can say, because some people are
I've fought in a lot of
about what I should be
elections,
doing.
and I think that the best way to reach people is to put something through the door. If you knock on doors, 7 out of 10 are either out or don't answer or something like that. But if you've got a piece of good literature and it goes through those doors, they're not forced to read it, but if it's good enough, they'll have a look at it. So I think that's a great opportunity, because while people are out delivering, I'll be delivering leaflets in my area, and UKIP people and all the different parties. If we had some good literature, we could get it out. But that, of course, presupposes somebody's going to produce it.
Yeah, from our point of view, you see, what we're not going to do is to go out there and say, we are here to convince you that the IPCC is wrong and it's a load of nonsense. What we will do is we will go and say, we have a policy to deliver secure and affordable energy. You are worried about your energy prices.
It's sort of what's behind it and how can it actually carry on? Because, I mean, you describe a picture of how, as different interest groups like scientists who want subsidies, politicians who want to collect taxes, how they just come together to do this. Now, that explains things up to a point, yet it's still going on. And the scientists themselves, I'm certain, know they're lying. They know they're making it up, they know the theory doesn't work. I mean, the data shows that. So if they're honest people, they should put their hands up, and sometimes they do. And I talk to some, and then they say, well, Piers, that's probably true, but I've got mouths to feed, and so forth. But there has to be some bigger thing behind it. Now, the only things I can make sense to me is really two. One is anything that involves trade and large amounts of money, banks and traders will love, because they can always get a markup. So they're creating a bubble of false value around this carbon industry.
Yeah.
That is one thing. And the other thing is the actual role of big oil, where they're portrayed as being, on our side, which is nonsense, because I don't see their money anywhere in here. If you read their website, it's very clear what they say. They say, BP says, yes, we know it's a problem. We believe there has to be a uniform price for carbon, which means that there has to be subsidies for, wind farms and so on, and they get in there to make the wind farms and so on. And once the price of energy goes up, it means what they had in the ground that was not worth mining is now worth billions. So they have an asset which is worth billions. And as far as I can see, the real force behind it all is actually big oil.
Rent seeking.
And when you turn on the TV and see Al Jazeera, wall-to-wall lies on green and never a peep against, you ask who funds Al Jazeera, and they're owned by Qatar, which is an oil state. So, I think we're up against a very good thing.
And a lot of the publicity against fracking is believed to be coming from Russia.
Oh, absolutely. They don't want fracking here. And
It's 65 years old, fracking.
Okay, true. And to reinforce the point, in 2004, I was invited to the Global Oil Summit in Houston, Texas, by somebody involved in the CO2 scam industry, actually, because they thought I should turn up and blah blah blah. And there I met the chief executive, and since we're not under Chatham House rules, I can say he was the chief executive of Exxon Mobil, and he produced a stack of papers about this thick, big book. He said, Piers, just to show you that we're on the case. And I looked at it, it was amazing. It was these sort of graphs that I produce now, and they know what's going on. They know the sun is doing things. And 3 months later, some people said, Piers, why don't you ask those guys for some money? So I got someone else who's in the industry to ask for money, and they said, oh, no. We don't want to upset the green lobby. So they decided between them, they had me there to think about it.
Yeah.
They wanted to, one, establish the truth, i.e. it is CO, it is the sun. Two, how can we make money? And the answer is, follow the scam. And they're doing that worldwide now. So we've got huge forces against us. Now that, I'm not being defeatist, but it means it's not surprising we run into little corners like we're here now.
It's the Emperor's clothes thing, isn't it? They all feel obliged to say the Emperor's wearing the clothes,
At
even though
some
they see the
point,
Emperor isn't wearing the
if
clothes.
we make an impact on the minds of some of us thinking in places like, Kingston and then Davy, but, we've got to find ways of making big hits. We should have a huge 24-hour pickets of somewhere, like the South African people, how they started that, and that eventually got through. But you see, I think we can't just rely on tweeting away. We've got to get into the public somehow.
That's right.
In the case of South Africa, though, it was novels, books rather like Cry the Beloved Country and Trevor Huddlestone's Not For.
There's loads of climate
Those are
books.
really good books, aren't they?
But those books, I have a list of books that are not generally sort of advertised to the public. I mean, obviously it started off with Nigel Lawson's book, but he had very great difficulty having published. But that list, which has got Ian Plimer's books and so on, I send that out, and that has quite a conversion effect.
But of course you won't reach people who are non-scientists by having scientific books.
No,
There's only one way
it's
of
a
doing
lot-
it.
a
One way you
lot
can
of
get
science.
beyond that
It's the
is-
price,
is
energy
things
price.
like-
Roger's absolutely right. Energy price.
And one way of getting at people is through the media, through plays, films, if you could get any, fictional stories that involve it. So somebody made a very good play, which was very popular.
Well, if you go back to the guy who wrote Jurassic Park, what was his name?
Crichton.
Crichton. He also wrote a book,
Excellent book.
State of Fear.
State of Fear.
And he quotes me and said,
Yeah.
Does he?
He also, in State of Fear, he quotes actual papers by Linson and so on. Real
Yeah.
papers.
Oh yeah, although it's fiction, it is annotated.
All the
like
papers are
science.
real.
oh sure, it's scientifically accurate. Everything in there on science is
Yeah.
accurate.
He died too young.
Yeah.
One thing is that we are, in August this year, we were 7 years away from August 2021, which will be the terse scenery of the South Sea Company bubble.
Yes.
Yes.
And I think this scam is on a bigger scale than that.
Oh.
Well, it is. That's why I said that. But okay, Stuart.
Piers,
Yeah.
does anybody remember peak oil from about 10 years ago?
Oh,
Yeah,
let's
Right,
talk about
peak
it.
oil's gone.
Yeah.
We've now got unlimited oil and
We've got
gas
unlimited oil.
in shale,
It's gas forever.
right? So the oil industry has simply changed tack. It was trying to maximise returns on a limited
scale.
resource. Now they've got unlimited resource, so they're backing away from all the diversification and green stuff that they were supporting. And you're seeing that. That's what you just described in this meeting.
It's not quite accurate though, because peak oil was based on the Hubbard sort of theory for the resource, which is conventional oil. The reason peak oil's gone away is you've got shale oil now coming in, and you could have always produced oil from coal and so on. So if you include all methods of getting to the final result, then the peak is a long way away. But Hubbard's probably right. I mean, there's other substances have gone through the peak, and it's that argument. But at the time that this was important, I pointed out that it will drift into the unconventional sources, the tar sands in Canada and so on and so forth, and it will disappear for that reason, and that's exactly what's happened.
But it's changed in the oil industry's funding mechanisms, their PR, everything.
Yes.
And if you want to get money off the oil industry, you've got to change your approach.
Oh yeah.
You've got to see
Yeah.
what they're trying to market
Yeah.
and go take money
Yeah.
appropriately.
Another question? No. So you want me to-
Problem solved.
Problem solved. Well, I was going to say something deep and meaningful. I forgot what it was.
Just before we move on, an advert.
It always pops in at this point.
On the 25th of November, the Energy Institute is running a debate between the political parties, including UKIP now. Originally it was going to be Conservative, Tory, the usual suspects, but I've got UKIP involved, and possibly now it's also going to involve Natalie Bennett of the Green Party, but we'll see. Unfortunately, the Energy Institute is charging for this meeting, and I think it's £60 for non-members. But if it may well be that if you write with a particular interest, you'll get it free. I'm getting it free. but I don't know. That's the 25th of November.
Yeah.
To find out about it, if you go on the Energy Institute's website and click on the calendar date on the 25th, you'll find it.
Can I say I would be quite relaxed if we stuck to the three main parties. I'm not sure we want the Lib Dems there.
I'm going to talk about three things. One, why we have to be crystal clear that CO2 actually has no effect on climate, why that is true and politically why it's necessary to say that. Two, what actually is affecting weather and climate and its predictability. And the third thing is what to do about it all. Right, so I'll begin with a quiz. How much CO2 is there in the atmosphere? Because you all know the answer to that, so I said. But I do try this at meetings. And I was at an insurers meeting yesterday and asked that, and people said, oh, maybe 20%, maybe 10%. You know what I mean? Completely nonsense. And the answer is 0.04%. And then the question, could you tell us what, if you know, who knows what proportion of that CO2 is due to man? Same sort of thing, or 20%, half of it, most of it, you know. Actually, it's 3% of that 0.04% is to do with man. So the idea that, you know, this could be, you know, causing climate is a bit of a stretch. Now, to get the facts right, to imagine if the atmosphere was Big Ben, the top of Big Ben, 1¼ inches added on top would be the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and a bird dropping on top of that 1¼ inches is man's contribution. And that, we're led to believe, is affecting the whole of the climate. I mean, you know. Okay, so it's got to be some pretty devilish mechanism. Right, now, the actual facts are that there's no correlation between CO2 production and, or extra CO2 and temperatures, other than that temperatures control the CO2. It's not CO2 controlling temperatures. So, you know, the objective of the observations are the theory doesn't work, it has to be scrapped, okay? So, you can't, it doesn't even help to give a bit of credibility, oh, there might be some effect. Because what they say then is, oh, there is going to be an effect, so you're going to delay the warming a bit or something. So they just say, well, all you're saying is there is an effect, it's just going to take longer to happen, because we're arguing about the amount. Actually, there is no effect, and if any, and the real effect is the opposite direction. And that is based on observations. Now, we can also produce physics arguments to show why there is no effect. But even if there is some CO2 effect, the next thing has to be, well, okay, how can you argue that man's CO2 is leading it? Because that is just clinically insane. For man's CO2 to lead the whole of the CO2, i.e. that bird dropping is in charge of the 1¼ inches, which somehow is in charge of the tower, but, you know, assuming that 1¼ inches is in charge of the tower, how can the 3% rule the 96%? And this is just complete madness, because it means you've got to have a conspiracy of nature. You've got to have termites, which produce 10 times man's CO2, and all the farting cows, and all the rice paddy fields, and all the rotting vegetables, and all the landfill sites which are doing whatever. They've got to have a meeting on a daily basis and say, okay boys, we're going to hold it until man produces, then we'll do the same. I mean, this is insane. It is complete insanity to attribute man to this CO2 game. It's deranged, right? It's deranged. And the third point to get clear on this, you know, clarity of cause is the role of the sea, the oceans, and here we have our globe, and I can put it in the middle now, where it belongs. Perhaps Andy can't see me then. Rule Britannia facing the camera. Okay, we get the jet stream while we're on with it. But this is 70% covered in water. Well, okay, so it means, because we all know, this is, one whose law it is, if you could enlighten me, Henry's law, that's right. a gas in equilibrium with a liquid will have a dynamic equilibrium quantity of gas in the atmosphere and gas in this case water, depending on the temperature. And you can't do anything other than just leave them to sort it out. CO2 comes out, CO2 goes in, and the equilibrium amount depends on the temperature. Now, given that the thermal capacity of the atmosphere is infinitesimal compared with the sea, we're talking about the sea surface temperature controlling the equilibrium amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. It can't do anything else. So that is why it's what it is. And why, when you look at objective data, that world CO2 levels follow changes in temperature, and they have to do that. They have to. There's no way of getting around it. You can't stop it. 70% of the Earth is in direct contact, and so that is the reason. Right now, this in a larger meeting I wouldn't do this, but since we're in a smaller meeting, we can just go into the actual only physical argument that the other side do have, which is this. You see, the BBC TV view of CO2 is, it's a blanket. It's a kind of a blanket of CO2. And you sort of, it absorbs and then it's redirected downwards. Now look, that argument, if you talk to anyone, they know it is complete nonsense. It's a bit like Roger. Suppose Roger is a black body radiator, he's a ground radiating, and I'm a piece of CO2 and I stand here, okay, and I'm absorbing. But what happens to this radiation? Well, the answer is it radiates out there. So I get in equilibrium temperature with Roger. That's what happens. It doesn't make Roger warmer. What Roger's radiating to me goes out there just the same. Put another way, suppose you have a piece of ground here, a piece of black ground if you want, doesn't matter, and you lift it up. Well, does the ground underneath get warmer? Well, of course it doesn't. Radiation comes from the ground into that thing you've got above it and out into space.
Does it change the rate of loss of heat?
It does. It will change.
And that has the same effect, doesn't it?
Yeah.
As well.
It changes the rate of change of stuff. But you see, well, when they give that so-called experiment, they show this CO2 in the bottle and non-CO2 in the bottle, shine lights in them. This one with the CO2 in gets warmer quicker. True. But if you leave them with the light shining in for an hour or two, they'll be at the same temperature at the end. There's a rate of change which is different. That's all. That is absolutely all. So that theory, as put like that, does not work. The only theory which could work is the lapse rate issue, right? Which is to say, well, okay, the top of the atmosphere radiates. And that's where the heat has to go out. So heat has to come from the bottom to the top, and it radiates out of the top. Now, if you add CO2, because the radiation has to come out from somewhere, it can only come out from the top, then there's more CO2, it makes the atmosphere thicker as far as infrared is concerned. So the radiation level has to be further out. And that means it's got to be a bit colder further out, and therefore it's got to be warmed up to give out the same amount of heat. So all the air underneath has to warm up a tiny bit. So that is the lapse rate argument. Okay? And you can't argue against it except to say, well, if that is the case, then why isn't it working? And the answer is there's two things which prevent it. One is, in the surface, you've got plants. If you add CO2 to the plants, they grow faster and they transpire water vapour faster, and that is a cooling thing. Bye.
Excuse us.
Thank you very much.
Bye, Roger.
They will transpire faster, and that causes a surface cooling. So actually, all forests are cooling the Earth's surface, and with more CO2, they cool it quicker. And if you double the amount of CO2, you increase the cooling rate by you increase the growth rate by 40%, and therefore the cooling. That is one thing. And the other thing that happens in the upper atmosphere, the argument that the of lifting the radiation level is not actually correct, because we're not in a static equilibrium, which is all the models, we're in a dynamic equilibrium, where you have, because the CO2 is added, or any greenhouse gas is added, the fluctuation in temperatures day and night will be bigger, because there's more CO2 and the rate of absorption of energy in and out goes up. Okay? So imagine this now is temperature level, temperature is measured for height. What happens in a static atmosphere is the CO2, the temperature level, the height of this is going to be the same, or the temperature of that is going to stay the same. Day and night, temperature goes up and down. Okay? So the average radiation is the fourth power of this one, averaged with the fourth power of that one. Now the fourth power of a fluctuation, the fourth power of that plus the fourth power of that divided by 2 is bigger than the fourth power of the middle. Okay? So if you have 1, 2 and 3 together, 1 to the fourth plus 3 to the fourth is 81.
82.
Yeah, it's 82 and half of them is 41. Okay? That's right. Whereas 2 to the fourth is
16.
what?
2 to the power of 4.
16, and half of that is 8. So you see that the mean of the fourth power is bigger than the fourth power of the mean. Okay? So the effect of the CO2 here is actually to increase the radiation rate of the upper atmosphere. That's what it does. Any greenhouse gas will do that. So, if that's true, then it could actually mean, well, this extra CO2 in the upper parts of the atmosphere is making it cooling, not a warming. But that is what is observed. What is actually observed? The official theory is, there's going to be, in the tropical regions, a cold spot, a cooling, a hot spot, a heating caused by this CO2 being up there making it warmer. What I'm saying is it should make a cooling. Well, the cooling is observed. So, end of story. But see, even that stuff, this is a kind of a second order little trivial blah blah blah. But I'm saying that even itself does not work. So, scientifically, the theory is nonsense from any point of view. Politically, it's silly to give them even a quarter of an inch because they take a mile.
So do you believe in the back radiation theory then, or not?
No, not really.
Not at all.
It's just as I explained, the equilibrium thing with Roger.
Right. There's a lot of argument over that, isn't there?
I know, there's a lot of argument over that, and some people get on very high horses, and you think, just hang on, can't. There is radiation in the atmosphere. There is interchange of radiation between, and you can do some calculations on it. Every level of the atmosphere. See, without radiation, you just have convection and conduction, and you'll get an equilibrium lapse rate due to that as you go up, because you do, when a gas has to do work when it rises and expands and then cools. Or put another way, a molecule going up and down, you notice this was slower when it was higher up. Whoops, slower. Whoops, sorry. So, gas molecules are going slower when they're higher up. They have to be. And there's little trajectories of doing that all the time. So that's why it's called a higher up in an atmosphere in equilibrium. It's nothing to do with CO2 or greenhouse gases or anything. It's just to do with gravity. And it also means, incidentally, that planets with more air, more atmosphere, have warmer surfaces if the outside is the same. Of course, there's a lot of work been done on that, and the previous climates were probably warmer because there was more atmosphere once. But that's another story. Pterodactyls could fly when there's a denser atmosphere. Sorry, I've lost my third slide. So yeah, the back radiation theory is okay, says all right. The interchange of energy between levels will be more rapid when there's CO2 or greenhouse gases between the levels. So that's fair enough. And that can then change the lapse rate slightly, because is another mechanism of interchange of energy other than just this convective stuff, you see. And you can do calculations on that. But then at the end of the day, whatever happens to that, it's going to be nailed in the case of CO2 effect nailed by the plants at the bottom doing something because of no CO2 and what I said about the dynamic equilibrium at the top. So all those calculations about back radiation and it's either zero or trivial, I would say. I mean, I think it's a zero, but the
Negatively trivial?
well, yeah. There is radiation, is what I'm saying, but to describe it as back radiation, which is warming the surface, that is wrong. That is just wrong, because the range of of infrared in the atmosphere at this level is 25 metres. You see, it's not the case that there's atmosphere CO2 up there radiating to us as they claim. If there's any radiation, you can only see, if you point a radiation infrared detector, it detects everything within 25 metres. Beyond that, it can't see anything. It's like looking through fog, you see. And then the 25 metres beyond that is affecting that level, and so on, and so on, and so on. So the idea of the back radiation coming from up there somehow is a nonsense. And furthermore, if you want to go into it in more detail, well, hang on, it's actually colder up there anyway. So what's this equilibrium of radiation? Well, it must mean that it's going to, heat can come out of here more easily than come back because we're warmer here. So all that talk about back radiation is, I would say, nonsense. But if you want to argue the point, I would say, you know, because you can go on forever, I'd say, well, it's actually totally irrelevant because of what I said about the nailing issues on the surface and even if it's true, it's going to be overruled by other things. A bit like saying even if the CO2 is true, it's the idea that man can rule it is also doubly nonsense. Okay. So that's what I've got to say about the CO2 issue. So we move on to what really does cause climate change. Going through these graphs, you guys know about the fact that world temperatures are closely correlated with average levels of solar activity, and that was shown in some of these graphs here. And the significant thing about the actual details is look at the signal. And Roger mentioned the 1,000-year signal, and on the point he said we could be reaching a peak of 1,000 years. I think we've passed the peak of 1,000 years, because it's a noisy thing anyway. We're on the decline. I mean, I don't think he disagrees with that, because he was talking generally, vaguely about 21st century.
The sine curve with temperature.
Yes, that's right. But you see, they're not perfectly formed.
Which isn't it like a cosine curve really? They're the same, just shifty.
Of course. So that is a long period. It's also not really the case you can argue that the slope of a 1,000-year thing and a 60-year thing are going to be, well, they can be together, but when you're getting near the top, the slope of this 1,000-year is very shallow anyway. So the extra slope, if you like, recently has got to be a coincidence of more rapid frequencies actually, and then you have a 22-year cycle is the most significant one in the atmosphere anyway, and the 60-year is a beat cycle between the 22-year and the magnetic cycle of the sun, which is what I was about to come to. When you do the Fourier analysis, i.e. analysis of the periodicities present in data, solar activity, the main thing is 11-year sunspots. World temperatures, the main thing is 22-year, which is magnetic. And the reason being that there's the Earth, magnetic field, there's the sun, this man here, and sometimes the sun's magnetic field goes that way, and 11 years later it goes that way. And then 11 years later it goes that way.
Lockwood's argument.
So there's a 22-year cycle of magnetic connectivity, because there's either going to be good or bad connections with the Earth's magnetic field always this way. So there's a 22-year cycle of connectivity. And we have the opinion that it is modulated by the plane of the moon's orbit, among other things. Now, that might surprise you, but I'm going to give you some facts here which are quite astounding. the spin rate of the sun spinning around there relative to the Earth is 27.2 days. So you see a sunspot there, 27.2 days, it will come back. I mean, new sunspots will come and so on, 27.2. And it varies from the equator to the poles and so on, but there's a fair, you can certainly choose a very fairly chosen average to make it 27.2 or any number of decimal points you want. 27.21 you could choose. Now, the moon, the plane of the moon's orbit as it goes around the Earth changes. It's going backwards like this all the time. So instead of the moon coming round, as you see the moon, it goes past every 29.5 days, right, between full moon and full moon. I mean, not the moon goes past, but it's full moon to full moon, 29.5 days. But the crossing of the Earth's orbit by the moon is 27.2 days. So it's the same, the moon crosses the Earth's orbit with the same period as the sunspots come past us as we're moving around the sun. The same. Within a decimal point, within half a decimal point. Now that is astounding, an astounding synchronicity. If you're into religion, of course, it's probably designer, whatever.
Good Lord.
It's like going to JD stores to buy some shoes. Anyway, there's one other place there is a whole number relationship. This is the Pluto and Charon. The relationship between the solar rotation, as you observe from Pluto, and the orbit of its moon Charon is 4.0. 1.0 for the Earth, 4.0 for the moon, for Charon. Well, all the other planet pairs, but planet and lunar pairs in the solar system is nothing. It's just whatever, you know. So there's something special going on with these things where the masses of the two bodies are comparable. I know the moon is lighter than the Earth, but you know, it's a big, big moon. There's no other planet apart from Pluto with a moon as big in comparison, you see. So there's something going on involving synchronicity caused by interruption to the solar wind. That's our theory anyway, okay? So, if it's true, then that's why you're going to get the beats of 60 years that we observe. Because the 27.2 turns into the whole plane of the moon's orbit goes around once in 18.6 years. So if you want to say, well, okay, that means, well, first of all, so you're going to have a 19-year and a 22-year. When are they going to repeat? And it's just music, isn't it? It's patterns. So if you've got a 22 and a 19, after one cycle you're 3 years behind. 19 to 22 is 3 years. 2 cycles you're 6 years behind. 3 cycles you're 9 years behind, which is half of that 18 where the moon's axis can be pointing at the sun or pointing away, you see, like that. So you're going to have to look into the half of the 18.6 instead of the whole 18.6, and you'll find you've got your 3 times 22 is 66, or 3 times 19 is whatever. So you get a mean of them, and basically you work it out, and you've got 59 or 58 or 60 years approximately, which is the envelope of the temperature cycle of US temperatures or indeed world temperatures. A magic. And if you look at the details, and this is a graph, it's very difficult to see if there's some way down. If you you look at it on the website. But what you find is that when you are at a odd cycle peak, which is the warmest part of the 20-year cycle, is the peak of the odd cycle, and then if that coincides with a eclipse of the moon in the first half of December, which is just done as a way of defining where the moon is, the moon's orbit is, if those coincide, you get an extra warming of the 22-year cycle. And this happened in cycle 23, which is the one just gone, we're now in 24, cycle 17, about 60 years before, and so on in the 40s, 30s, 40s, cycle 11, which was can't really go inside. There's a little graph there with it all on. It's that one, which is number 24, graph number 22. There we are. So, and if this is true, then it will have certain other implications, because if you want to look at the 22 and the 19 in a sort of wider scale, so you can see the 60-year bins will happen and they're observed, then since 6 times 22 is 12 times 11, isn't it? So that's 132. And then 7 times 19 is 133. So around 131, 132, 133 years, you're going to get repeated, roughly. It's not beats, it's repeatings of close things. So if this is true, then it means that 132 years or so ago, we might get similar weathers. Well, in 2007, there were floods in the UK, and I spoke at a dinner in Imperial College.
Like in 1875?
Like in 1875, see, he's reading the script there.
I know it.
I know you know it.
From you. You told me well.
Yeah, okay. I said this at a dinner in Imperial College when it had just been raining and Pius, whatever his name, had been singing, you know, in the rain in Wimbledon. I said, well, there might be more of these next year and so forth, because there were floods in 1875, 1876 and 1877, and there was also in 2007, 2008 and 2009, which is 132 years later. And the Met Office forecast for those 3 years, as you know, were barbecue summers.
At least for 2007 and 9, I don't know about 2008.
What, did they have barbecue summer?
For 2007 and 9, they didn't use the word barbecue summer for 2007, but another hot one.
Yeah. Well, they had hot for all of them, but they were hottest, I suppose, in 07 and 09, or they believe they would be, yeah. And then it goes on, but the most dramatic one was 2012, where it was more or less close to the wettest in southern England on record in 1880, is that right? That must be right, yes. And 2012 was also close to the record wettest in southern England. So there's something definitely going on. But I must stress, it's not clockwork. You can't just go back and say, oh yeah, that's the same weather, because there's other things happening, namely the stratospheric winds might be not doing what you want them to do. And so forth. And Judy's been working on the stratospheric wind problem, which has given us some guidance. Okay, so that is kind of a thing I could say verbally without doing much on pictures. The other things worth mentioning on pictures, I think, is the big storms we've been have been happening. It's just to show that using look-back techniques we can make forecasts. Basic idea is that the weather in the past is going to happen again, or what we're seeing now has always happened, something's happened in the past. So it doesn't mean exactly 132 years ago, it means we've got these weather action indicators which describe influences, and there will be times in the past where the total influences and the modulations are similar. So we can use the weather in the past with some modification to make the weather in the future. And we've been doing this quite successfully with extreme events. The big storm of October the 28th, 2013, which has been named my storm by others, I have to say, although I did like the idea. We predicted that 23 weeks ahead and announced that at a conference in Geneva. We didn't say the date exactly, we said end of or late October, southern England, and indeed that was exactly what happened. And we also have these new ideas about changing tracks of storms. And we said, well, that storm, as it comes to England, because of, in this case, it was going to come in an extra activity period, we said it was going to track to the right of the official track and also be more intense as well. And the official track was to go through centre of England, something like that, and we said it would go further south, which it did, and it was more intense.
Yellow warnings moved south as well.
They did.
On the very day.
They did. But they didn't move until the day. And then, following year, i.e. this year, we did have another storm. It wasn't such a big deal, but nevertheless it was an important thing and as a tropical storm remnant, and more in the Scotland direction. But again, we said it is going to be a bit more intense. They're not always that, it could be the opposite, but we said specifically it would be more intense, and again we'll go a bit further south. And that is again the case, that is what happened. So you might wonder why the powers that be aren't interested. Well, the answer is, I think, there's such huge interest against objective science. And I used to think when I went to Imperial College as a student that this is the answer. Science and the empire will lead us always, or whatever. Scientia imperie ducret tutamem. i.e., you have to go for the truth. Well, yes, you do, but on the other hand, what is deemed to be true is decided by influence groups.